One of the first videos I made on this channel was going over what I had as my top 10 Super Nintendo video games. I was still pretty new to the whole YouTube content creation game, and admittedly, the quality of it wasn't all that great. The link to this original video is in the description in case you're curious. One of the many issues that I have with it, thanks to my buddy Ujabroni for pointing it out, was the fact that I sat on the fence way too frickin' hard and named 4 different games for the number 1 spot. Besides providing you a bit better quality for the video, I wanted to give you my ranking of these games with none of that fence sitting or ties whatsoever. I've done another ranking of Super Nintendo games without first-party Nintendo and Squaresoft titles. There's a link to that also in the description. And honestly, this top 25 ended up being surprisingly harder than even that. I think the idea of ranking some of these most loved games of mine on my favorite video game console of all time was more difficult than I ever imagined it to be. The only rule is that the games must have been released on the Super Nintendo between the years it was active, 1990 to 1998. And while my list will vary greatly from yours, I encourage you to let me know in the comments section below your thoughts, your favorite games for the system, and remember, of course, to like and subscribe. I mention this not only to appease the algorithmic gods, but to remind you all that my list will probably be missing classic games, like Super Mario Kart, Desert Strike, Terranigma, and most likely more. The aforementioned games rated between 7 and 8 on my own specific measuring scale that I have, but even that wasn't high enough to crack the top 25. That's just how good this system is, and that's going to be an ongoing theme with this particular list. I also tend to lean heavily into RPGs, which of course the Super Nintendo was an absolute beast for. There will be no honorable mentions with the video because, well, heck, I don't need to since I'm going to be going with a top 25. Everything I feel that should be will be covered here. The first set of games also hit between about an 8 to a 9 out of 10 on my own scale that I have. So even though the next 10 games I'm going to go over are the number 25 to number 16 spot, these are excellent video games. And my first one is number 25, NBA Jam Tournament Edition, released February 23rd, 1995. This was number 6 on my No Nintendo Square list. This is the only sports game on my list because, well, I'm not the biggest fan of sports ball. Okay, that's a lie. I'm not the biggest fan of how sports ball is depicted in video games. But that's a whole nother conversation. This being the only sports ball game means that Super Nintendo classics like Ken Griffey Baseball, Tecmo Super Bowl, and even the likes of Kirby's Dream Course aren't going to appear on my list here. That's because the arcade-style gameplay of NBA Jam has been amped up in this sequel, and it also allows 4 players to play at once via the Super Nintendo multi-tap. From ridiculously crazy dunks, to shots literally being on fire, to even slaptastic Will Smith being able to ball, this game plays wonderfully and is truly a product of its time. I've also got a special place in my heart for this entry. It came out in the 90s, and I'm from the Chicagoland area. You know what that means. Number 24, Contra 3, The Alien Wars. Released March 26, 1992. This was number 8 on my No Nintendo Square list. While Super C is a great game, I felt like it wasn't nearly as good as the original Contra on the NES. And while The Alien Wars is billed as the 3rd game in the series, I feel like this is a sequel that truly betters the previous original Contra in so many ways. All the games in this series are tough as nails hard, with one-hit deaths and crazy enemy placement. But new to Alien Wars are top-down segments reminiscent of a Zelda game, as well as crazy action set pieces where Bill and Lance must ride motorcycles to jump between missiles, taking down enemies as they go. 2-player simultaneous action is standard fare for a Contra title, making this a blast to play with a friend. And while the music isn't nearly as good as the original NES Contra, Alien Wars soundtrack is still great. This is currently playable in the Contra Anniversary Collection, available in all major consoles. Number 23, Donkey Kong Country 3, Dixie Kong's Double Trouble. Released November 18th, 1996. I think I heard this from YouTube content creator Some Call Me Johnny. He said that this entry is probably the best embodiment of the name Donkey Kong Country, and I'm inclined to agree with them. We see Dixie and her cousin, Kiddy Kong, go out on a rescue mission to recover both DK and Diddy Kong, kidnapped by King K. Rool as Baron K. Roolenstein. But to do so, they freely explore a large world map divided in smaller areas with some interactivity via vehicles like jet skis and hovercraft. It truly feels like Donkey Kong is exploring the country. Except, of course, it's Dixie Kong. The level design doesn't miss a step from previous entries, with a bunch of fun variety and collectibles, which the latter are standard fare for a rare game. The music is probably the weakest of the three entries thus far, most likely due to switching from David Weiss to Evelyn Fisher, but it is still quite good, and it's currently playable in the Nintendo Switch's NSO service. Number 22. Super Street Fighter II Turbo Hyper Fighting, released August 1st, 1993. This was number 9 on my No Nintendo Square list. I personally have a greater fondness for the original World Warrior version of this that released previously on the SNES. Lest we forget though, Hyper Fighting is truly the better version. It added the 4 playable boss characters, better balanced the characters, added moves additionally to some of them, made some of the levels more akin to their arcade counterpart, at least from my experience, and added the ability to speed up the gameplay. This last point was nice for those who had felt the overall movement speed of the original for the characters was too slow. Now, I never had that issue with it myself, so seeing the increased speed was a little disorientating for me. The music is absolutely top-notch too, with fantastic themes on stages to match the characters so well. And obviously, this is fighting game perfection on the SNES, beating even that of Super Street Fighter II, as well as all but one of the Mortal Kombat games. And you can play this entry on the Street Fighter 30th Anniversary Collection, the Capcom Arcade Collection, and many of the arcade 1-up cabinets physically out in the wild. Number 21. Seiken Densetsu 3, now referred to as Trials of Mana, released September 30th, 1995. This entry we never got stateside, which is a shame because the game is generally superior to its predecessor, Secret of Mana. The only downgrade is that 3-player simultaneous gameplay is replaced with only 2 players, though if you play through emulation it can be patched right back in. Besides this, the gameplay is much smoother, power and magic progression is less grindy, and the sprites and environments a hairbreadth more detailed. The music is just as good as Secret of Mana, which is saying something since that entry had some real bangers in it. Trials of Mana also has a greater amount of replayability with 6 selectable characters. 3 can be chosen with one of the 3 leading the primary story. Whomever the player chooses will determine the location of the final dungeon and who the main villain will be. You can play this entry on the Collection of Mana, available on all major consoles. Number 20. Tiny Toon Adventures Buster Busts Loose, released February 1993. This was number 7 on my No Nintendo Square list. This entry is probably the best licensed property game on the SNES. Yeah, possibly even better than the Super Star Wars series. Of course, I generally don't care for licensed property games, but Konami did this one right. It mixes fun platforming and gameplay with good sound effects, music, and expressive sprites, throwing in a number of surprisingly smooth sections, much like what we see in Sonic the Hedgehog games, and we get quite an excellent game overall. Man, I still need to see the Tiny Toons reboot that just came out September of 2023. Number 19. Soul Blazer, released November 27th, 1992. This was number 5 on my No Nintendo Squaresoft list. It's probably sacrilege that this entry is above Illusion of Gaia and Terranigma, the 2 games released in the Quintet trilogy after this one. But I've got a soft spot for Soul Blazer, from the sound effects pulled directly from ActRaiser to the Zelda and action RPG-like gameplay. I genuinely think this game's a ton of fun. Even if a good majority of the time is spent fighting monsters that pop out of layers, the variety and results from clearing said layers is pretty neat to see. And clearing layers adds to villages, much like how doing so in ActRaiser progresses the simulation portion of the story as well. The music is also quite good, marrying the melodic and ambient, depending on the many varied and beautiful environments. I'm still hoping it will get re-released by Square Enix, along with the aforementioned Illusion of Gaia and Terranigma. Heck, they did the Collection of Mana, right? Number 18. Donkey Kong Country 1, released November 21st, 1994. The game that saved the Super Nintendo from the Sony PlayStation. Or at least gave Nintendo a 2-year pass until they could release the Nintendo 64. The graphics did look absolutely phenomenal at the time and even still do today. This is really surprising, especially since the 3D-ish look sometimes doesn't age well, but again, the 3D models themselves were really meant to be used for sprites, which works so well on the Super Nintendo. I generally like this entry better than the third one because the music is a bit better. I loved playing both as DK and Diddy, and the overall gameplay and look was such an ambitious leap for the time. And you can play this on the Nintendo Switch's NSO service. Number 17. Super Castlevania 4, released December 4th, 1991. This was number 4 on my No Nintendo Square list. I'd be hard-pressed to find which entry I think is better, this or the Genesis Castlevania Bloodlines, and the latter I've only played for the last year or so, whereas Super Castlevania 4, I've got over 30 years of gameplay. And while it's a remake of the first and original Castlevania entry, it redoes everything in a grand style. Yeah, some of the Mode 7 graphics can be overused, but the levels are long, varied, and missing that extremely hard difficulty that the original one had. Simon Belmont himself has never controlled better, and future entries in the respective Belmonts won't ever control as good. And dear God, the music in this game is absolutely fantastic. But again, that's par for the course for the Castlevania series. You can play this on the Castlevania Anniversary Collection, available on all major consoles. Number 16. SimCity, released August 23rd, 1991. While the original SimCity released back in 1989 for various PC systems, I felt like the series really picked up steam when it published as a first-party Nintendo title here on the SNES. Not only did it have the classic build your city gameplay with many different types of buildings to support your growing city, it also had a number of nods to Nintendo, such as the attacking Bowser disaster and the Mario statue, buildable when the player manages to reach a city that has over 500,000 people. I'm sad to say, though, my brothers and I never reached that lofty height. The highest I could get was around 330,000. The music is decent, which it darn well better be since it repeats on a continuous loop. Though thankfully it does change whenever the city itself upgrades via class when it reaches certain population levels. This was such a cool game to play as a kid. I remember my cousin and I planning cities on paper whenever we hung out so we could try new types of villages when we could finally play the game. So for the next 7 games or so, this marks the Super Nintendo games that have a rank between a 9 and a near perfect 10. They're not hitting the perfect 10 out of 10 yet, but rest assured, these games are all absolutely worth your time checking out and or playing. They're also tremendous favorites of mine, all nearly my favorite or within the top 3 of favorite entries within their respective series. Number 15. Tetris and Dr. Mario, released December 30th, 1994. Where I may end up having less favorability on genres like the sports one, I make up for that instead with a greater love for the puzzle games. Games like Puyo, Puzzle Bobble, and more are good, but I love Tetris and all of the various spin-offs and offshoots it's gotten. And this is where Tetris and Dr. Mario shine. Not only do we get excellent versions of each individual game, both including versus 2-player and versus computer modes, but the mixed match mode is the real winner here. I do wish this mode had 1-player and versus computer, but it's still a really great time. Moving from Tetris B-type, then Dr. Mario, then A-type until the total time is up, getting as high a score as possible is a lot of fun. We saw a great cross-play, albeit one that just sounds too kiddish for my tastes, with Puyo Puyo Tetris 1 and 2. But I think it's time Nintendo crosses over Tetris and Dr. Mario again, and maybe throws in a couple puzzle games from its roster like Yoshi's Cookie, or another entry that'll appear shortly on my top list here. Number 14. Mortal Kombat 2, released September 9th, 1994. This was number 3 on my No Nintendo Square list. While the first entry played well enough, Nintendo crippled it with a crazy amount of censorship that no blood code could ever hope to bring back. Thankfully, Mortal Kombat 2 is pretty much the exact same as the arcade version with a few tweaks. One of them, I'll argue, being the one-player computer AI is not as cheap as heck. YouTube content creator MVG confirmed this was a thing too. I'll include a link in the description to his video in case you're curious or want to hear more of this. All of this, though, adds up to one of the best versions of Mortal Kombat ever made. Great music, excellent character roster, fighting that feels tight, all surrounded by the love and gore one can expect from the Mortal Kombat series. Number 13, Tetris Attack. Released August 11th, 1996. This puzzler kind of reminds me of Bejeweled, as the player clears titles by matching 3 or more in a row, but where it doesn't have the ability to swap tiles vertically, it does allow for quicker maneuverability and more control, especially with creating chains. What's cool about this game is that it not only has a one-player story mode, it also has versus 2-player, versus computer, timed, endless, and a puzzle mode to boot. This entry got future iterations via Pokemon Puzzle League, then just kind of became Puzzle League after that, but it's really this Super Nintendo one being probably the best version, as the Yoshi aesthetic and the music are fantastic, borrowed of course from Super Mario World 2 Yoshi's Island. The original version, the Japanese one, does not have any of the Yoshi's Island aesthetics and is playable on the Nintendo Switch's NSO service and is called Panel de Pan. Number 12, Kirby Superstar, released September 20th, 1996. I remember the big rallying cry for this game was that it had 8 games in one, but really it's essentially the same game divided in smaller sets of levels, each with their own unique rules, not counting of course the actual mini-games of Megaton Punch and Samurai Kirby. Each of these quote-unquote games are excellent for what they are though. Spring Breeze is a shortened remake of the first game in the series, Kirby's Dream Land, that appeared on the Game Boy. Gourmet Race is a set of 3 levels where Kirby has his speed doubled and must race King Dedede. Consequently, the oft-remixed music track of the same name appears in every Smash Bros. Game since. The Great Cave Offensive sees Kirby in a Metroidvania-like exploration of a vast underground area, working to escape and collect as many treasures as he can, many of these being various items from other Nintendo series. All of these are tied to a gameplay loop where the player controls Kirby in a design quite similar to his presence in Smash Bros., up to and including being able to guard by holding R or L. And it's this gameplay, tied to each of the various modes in the game, that give the greatest amount of fun factor. Kirby, the other enemy, and character sprites, along with the environments and music, are cute, bubbly, and full of personality. Even with Kirby and the Forgotten Land being released, I still believe Kirby Superstar is the best game in the series still, and you can play it on the Nintendo Switch's NSO service. Number 11, Final Fantasy IV, released November 23rd, 1991. This was number 7 on my original top 10 list and number 3 on my top 10 Final Fantasy list. And the fact that this is 3rd on a list of my favorite series of all time, yet doesn't even crack the top 10 for this Super Nintendo list, should still be indicative of the strength and breadth of this console. This 4th entry in the series, originally released as the 2nd in the US, has the most robust story for an RPG in Final Fantasy at the time of its release, and really since the inception of the NES. We see main character Cecil, a Dark Knight from the Kingdom of Baron, turn away from the life of darkness put forth by his king, and seek a greater light in redemption and good. Turn-based combat from the first 3 entries, also like the overall Dragon Quest series and many other RPGs, has been replaced with the active time battle system, of which future games in the Final Fantasy series will use up to and through the 9th entry. The US version has quite a poor translation into English, thanks in part to being translated by those who spoke English as a second language. I could say the game was made easy for the US audience, but I think the better term here would be simplified. This is because the creators, when porting it to the US, removed a large number of battle commands for various characters, a few spells, especially in the White Mage class, a great number of recovery items, opting to replace them all with a standard remedy that cured all ailments, and of course swung the ban hammer against various things like the spell Holy, and an axe that was timed to slice a character of the party during said story. With all that being said though, I recommend playing the Pixel Remaster version of this entry, available on the Nintendo Switch, PS4 and 5, and Steam. Oh, and obviously the music is an absolute masterclass in orchestration. but that's to be expected when it was composed by the great Nobuo Uematsu. Number 10. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 4: Turtles in Time, released August 15th, 1992. This was number 2 on my No Nintendo Square list. I really do wish this version was made to take advantage of the SNES multi-tap, which allowed for 4 people to play at once. The multi-tap was released a year after this game came out. Sadly though, that's left for the arcade version of this, which honestly I like a bit less than this Super Nintendo one. While the arcade version had more voice samples, the SNES version has more levels, use of Mode 7 graphics in a pretty interesting way, and a number of references added to reference the movie masterpiece that is TMNT 2: Secret of the Ooze. The biggest one of this would be Super Shredder replacing the standard version of Shredder as the last boss, though unfortunately Vanilla Ice doesn't make an appearance anywhere in the game. The gameplay is standard beat-em-up fare, though with a great amount of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles formula. All 4 turtles are fairly interchangeable, though they all move and play fantastically. Fighting enemies also feels great, with fantastic crunchy sound effects, along with the sprites and environments being colorful and looking really well. And the music, Konami really gets us with an absolute fantastic soundtrack, also worthy of the place it has earned in this top list of mine. This game is one of many of the 90s generations of Turtles games playable right now on the Cowabunga collection, available for all major consoles. Number 9. Donkey Kong Country 2: Diddy's Kong Quest, released December 4th, 1995. This was number 8 on my original top 10 list. This is by far the best of the Donkey Kong Country games, although it takes a bit of the country and replaces it with more pirate than anything. Regardless of this, there is still a very large variety of levels, many of them new even from the previous entry. We see Diddy Kong getting the spotlight, and he revels in it. Joining him is his girlfriend Dixie Kong, who moves a little bit slower than he, but has a cool helicopter spin move that slows her descent. This entry sees the bonus levels no longer focus on giving extra lives and bananas to the Kongs, but instead help to unlock the extra quote-unquote lost levels, which when beaten unlock another go against King K. Rool, or I mean Captain K. Rool, and the secret ending. Everything has seen streamlining within this entry when compared to the original, up to and including new animal buddies like Ratley and Squitter, but by far the best part of this game is the soundtrack. I'd argue this is David Wise's finest composition of all time, with many themes like Sticker Brush Symphony making reappearances in future games like Tropical Freeze and even Super Smash Bros. And regarding Tropical Freeze, that is probably a very close second to Donkey Kong Country 2, and it's currently playable on the Nintendo Switch NSO service. Okay, so from here on out, we're going to finish the last 8 entries with what I would easily rate as 10 out of 10 games. And that means, for all intents and purposes, these are all masterpieces. If there are any discernible flaws, they're made near invisible to the absolutely stellar gameplay, controls, graphics, music, and sound. Number 8. Super Mario World 2: Yoshi's Island, released October 4th, 1995. This was number 10 on my original top 10 list. While this was subtitled the official sequel to Super Mario World, it deviates so much from it, and in many a good way. The player now controls a team of Yoshis instead of Mario, racing to reunite Baby Mario to Baby Luigi and deliver them to their parents. This last step done apparently by the stork. The Yoshis themselves are invulnerable to enemy attacks, though they will still instantly die if falling into a pit, touching lava, and large pencil-like spikes. While invulnerable to enemy attacks, the Yoshis do get stunned and Baby Mario gets dumped off their back. And this is where the worst part of the game occurs. Baby Mario's crying. For me, I've found his crying just mildly annoying, but it's meant to be that way to drive the player to recover Mario quickly. When the player loses Mario due to a hit, there's a timer that starts running, and if it hits 0, then weird little toadies reminiscent to the creepy ghost guy from Ghostbusters 2 come and take Baby Mario away. While Yoshi's Island only has a total of 54 playable levels, where Super Mario World had roughly 73, remember that star 96 refers to total number of exits, not levels. The length of the levels are much longer, and thus the timer has also been removed. With additional collectibles like red coins and flowers, winnable items in bonus games, and unlockable levels, there's a lot of game to play here. And the overall crayon aesthetic in the environment manages to look creative, but also not overly kiddie like how Yoshi's story felt. The sprites are quite detailed, up to and including the fantastically designed bosses. The music is stellar, especially that last boss, which is still one of the best fights in a Super Mario game or spin-off since. You can play this entry in the Nintendo Switch's NSO service. You can also play the Game Boy Advance version on the NSO expansion pack, though I do not recommend playing that one. While it does have an extra level in every one of the 6 worlds, the colors are a bit washed out, and they added in the annoying voices from Yoshi's story to all of the Yoshis. Mario crying is enough for me. Number 7. Super Mario RPG Legend of the Seven Stars, released May 13th, 1996. This was number 5 on my original top 10 list. This is an absolutely stellar game as it merges turn-based RPG mechanics with the overall world of Super Mario, throwing in additional battle mechanisms like timed hits. As simple as I make this sound, what we get is one of the best RPGs on a console with a lot of heavy RPG hitters in it. The game starts with Mario having to rescue Princess Toadstool, Peach, from Bowser, which includes the same music from Super Mario Bros. 3 when Mario does end up fighting him. A giant sword crashes into Bowser's keep or castle and sends Mario, Peach, and Bowser into the wind, while also splitting the Star Road into 7 different star pieces. Mario's grand adventure takes him through the Mushroom Kingdom as well as never-before-seen lands like Nimbus Kingdom, Moleville, Star Hill, and many more. While still being turn-based, battles feel quick and full of action. The on-the-field platforming is surprisingly concise and well done, and the sprites and environments do well with the isometric look. Man, I wish Sonic 3D Blast did it this well. And if you're looking for a grand adventure, check out the remake of this game, simply titled Super Mario RPG for the Nintendo Switch. Number 6. Mega Man X, released January 19th, 1994. This was number 1 on my No Nintendo Square list, as well as number 6 on my original top 10. I cannot overstate just how great of an action platformer this game is. It takes the standard Mega Man formula of beating 8 robot masters in the order of the player's choosing and gaining their powers, but also adds upgrades to Mega Man X himself that improves his abilities greatly. These include halving damage with new armor, doubling mobility with the power slide boots, and adding a 3rd level of charging and an additional one for all of the abilities X gains when beating Robot Masters with the arm cannon. There's also getting a helmet which gives X an extra hard head. Yeah, this last one's not as impressive, but necessary nonetheless to gain a couple of the other abilities. The power slide ability, though, I feel adds a large amount of speed to X himself, and even when the OG Mega Man gained the slide ability in Mega Man 3, he didn't feel quite as fast as X does with this. The stages to each of the Robot Masters, which coincidentally are actually called Mavericks, have many different looking environments, from snowy to caves to underwater, with enemies and sprites that are quite detailed and match well. The music, while on par with the overall level of quality with Mega Man, is absolutely amazing and is one of the greatest on the SNES. And while future games in the Mega Man X series are good to mediocre, none were as good as this original one. And you can play it on the Mega Man X Legacy Collection, available on all major consoles. Number 5. The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, released November 21st, 1991. This was number 9 on my original top 10 list. Yes, you can see I've bumped this one up quite a bit from my previous list where it appeared. Upon further reflection, I can find absolutely no fault with this game. This is literally the perfect 2D overhead Zelda game. Being the 3rd game in the series at this point, instead of continuing the platforming style we saw in the 2nd entry, it goes back to the overhead view that the 1st entry had. We see Link saving Zelda as the opening act, where he then is put on a quest to retrieve the Master Sword and put down the evil wizard Agnem. Once he is defeated, a parallel world is unlocked that mirrors the primary world Link is from, and over 2 times the amount of dungeons he has already completed then unlock. These generally get tougher as Link progresses, but aren't overly complex, unlike Ocarina of Time's Water Temple. There's also fantastic swordplay and items like bombs and the bow and arrow, as well as the absolutely iconic and fantastic soundtrack, honestly making Link to the Past the pinnacle of Legend of Zelda gameplay. I did enjoy the 3DS sequel to this game, Link Between Worlds, though in a way it treaded a fair bit too much on the nostalgia towards this original title. Regarding Link to the Past, you can play it on the Nintendo Switch's NSO service. Number 4. Super Mario World, released August 23, 1991. This was number 1 on my fence-sitting top 10 list. While the previous entry, Link to the Past, is what I consider the third best Zelda game, Super Mario World is my number 1 here. Yet again, this speaks to the strength of the Super Nintendo as a console with its game selection that Super Mario World only hits number 4 on this list. Hopefully you can see why I sat on the fence originally. Now, Super Mario World was subtitled as Super Mario Bros. 4. It does lose a couple suits that only appeared a handful of times in the third entry, does add the Super Cape Feather power-up, and the most iconic power-up of all time, and now main character to the series, Yoshi. I also felt the level length had increased from the third entry too. The overhead map now allows free exploration to areas all around Dinosaur Land, including going through levels previously cleared. This ability is highlighted as out of the 73 levels in the game, there are a total of 96 exits, up to and including access to the Hidden Star Road and Special Zone worlds. Mario controls absolutely phenomenally. The sprites are detailed and colorful, environments varied, and level design the top of its game. Though, to this last point, that's pretty much on par for the course for Mario games, isn't it? While you can play the Game Boy Advance version of this on the Nintendo Switch's NSO expansion pack, I recommend doing the original Super Nintendo one. No superfluous voicing in the original. Number 3. Final Fantasy VI, released October 11th, 1994. This is my favorite series of all time, favorite video game of all time, and while I did straddle the fence on my last general top 10 list, I did speak to this game last. So how the heck does it end up in third place? These last 2 games that I'm going to go over are just that damn good. Getting back to Final Fantasy VI though, this game is absolutely the pinnacle of JRPGs and the Final Fantasy series up to this point. The battle system is absolutely phenomenal, though admittedly this is probably one of the easiest entries in the series, and there are a few characters who have abilities that are quite extra. Gau, Mog, Setzer, Realm, Umara, I'm looking at you. The story starts off with Terra, a mysterious young woman that has the innate power of magic, an ability long thought lost from over 1,000 years ago. Her journey takes her to meeting a wonderful cast of characters like Locke the Treasure Hunter and King Edgar of Figaro. This game also features not only one of the greatest villains in the Final Fantasy series, but in all of video games, Kefka. And spoiler alert, his nihilism and ambition actually succeeds and apocalypse rains down on the planet, with the heroes having to reunite, rebuild, and fight Kefka once again. The music, once again conducted by Nobuo Uematsu, is one of the best video game soundtracks ever made. Nobu-san has even remarked in the past that the 6th entry remains his favorite soundtrack he's made, and he's even performed the song Dark World from the soundtrack in past Distant World Final Fantasy Symphony concerts before. The best version of this game is the Pixel Remaster, and you can play it on the Nintendo Switch, PS4 and 5, and Steam. Number 2. Super Metroid, released April 18th, 1994. This was also number 1 on my fence-sitting top 10 list. This game and the number 1 would probably be my best video games of all time, with good reason. Super Metroid is perfection personified. It takes the Metroidvania-style action from the first 2 entries of the series, expands the world greatly with a diverse set of environments, adding in a map for easier tracking of position, all while maintaining that overall feeling of isolation that the early part of the Metroid series was most renowned for. There's a whole diverse set of flora and fauna, friendly and foe alike, that is on display as Samus Aran explores the planet Zebes. Like standard Metroidvania fare, Samus can only progress upon finding different items and weapons that can be used to clear her path. Keeping to this formula, she progresses in the hopes of finding a Metroid hatchling she recovered on a previous mission that was stolen by the villainous Ridley. I've seen a number of YouTube content creators playing this entry for the first time and mention how fantastic the game is with the overall gameplay loop, and you too can play this on the Nintendo Switch's NSO service. Number 1. Chrono Trigger, released August 11th, 1995. This was also number 1 on my fence-sitting top 10 list. This is it, the number 1 game, and I say that with no hyperbole. This is the number 1 game on my SNES list, on my RPG list, all-time video game list, and whatever other list that this game could fit on. Before the Square Enix merger in 2003, both companies came together to help create this game. This includes Final Fantasy series creator Hironobu Sakaguchi, Dragon Quest series creator Yuji Horii, and Dragon Quest series character designer and creator of Dragon Ball Z, Akira Toriyama, with the music being composed by Nobuo Uematsu. This literally is taking the best of JRPGs for its time and having them sit down and create a video game together. And what a hell of a video game! This sees silent protagonist Chrono waking up and planning to meet his friend Luca's stall at a local fair. After a chance run-in with a young woman named Marley, the three of them are foisted through time in a battle for the fate of the planet. While the game boasts multiple endings, these are pretty much only available depending on when the game is beaten during the story, and thus may not be available until the player beats the game through for the first time. Fortunately, these extra endings are rather unessential, not really adding too much to the overall story, besides of course the main ending that occurs at the end of the game. One funny thing with this game is that I've heard players talk about how it takes them 20 to 40 hours to beat it, though my playthroughs have only been about 10 to 15 hours each. This of course doesn't include New Game Plus, which Chrono Trigger helped to pioneer as a device for video games as we know it today. The battle system is active time battle from the Final Fantasy series, though the maximum party of 3 can often perform techniques together once they have their turns open and available. The sprite work for the time is absolutely incredible too, along with greatly detailed environments. The story, with the many number of twists and layers, is peak RPG fare even to this day. The game was ported to the PS1 and then later to the DS, with some additional content added to this later version, though I've found it a bit unnecessary. Chrono Trigger was also ported to mobile devices and Steam, albeit poorly, though thankfully updates have since fixed them. The sequel, Chrono Cross, originally came out on the PS1, and a remaster of sorts is available for it on all major consoles, though I use the term sequel quite loosely there. So that's my top 25 Super Nintendo game list, and as you can tell, I've definitely gotten off the fence and ranked these proper. And yes, I recognize I'm missing a number of titles like Earthbound, Killer Instinct, F-Zero, Super Punch-Out, and more. While these and others are great, I just felt like the 25 here were better entries in every way. Make sure to let me know in the comments section below if I should have included these or others that I might have missed, and whether or not you believe my order should be different at all. Thanks again for watching, and have a great day.